Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our Reporter Night series at Columbia University. My name is Steve Cohen, and I'm the Senior Vice Dean of Columbia's School of Professional Studies and a professor in the practice of public affairs at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. I'm also the director of the MPA program in Environmental Science and Policy, as well as Columbia's Masters of Sustainability Management program. I'd once again like to start by thanking Professor Claudia Dreifus, the distinguished science feature writer of the New York Times, for putting this virtual event together for Columbia students, as well as faculty and the general public. Claudia teaches at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs and in the Sustainability Management program at Columbia's Earth Institute and School of Professional Studies. She teaches a wonderful class called Writing about Global Science for the International Media. Today, her students are joining us, and together she and they will interview our esteemed panel of top science writers and reporters. We welcome New York Times Science Correspondent Apoorva Mandavilli, along with Jeffery DelViscio, Senior Multimedia and Editor at Scientific American, and also welcome John Timmer, Senior Science Editor at Ars Technica, and Katherine Bagley, Managing Editor of YaleEnvironment360. Thank you for participating in our panel discussion this evening. We look forward to learning about our panel's career paths, as well as the peaks and valleys of their day-to-day work in journalism and media. With that, I'd like to hand over the virtual podium to Professor Claudia Dreifus.
Thank you so much, Dean Cohen, and thank you for helping to organize these events. I'd like to tell a little story about how Editor's Night came to happen virtually. Um, I usually do this program at Editor's Night as part of my regular courses, and what I do is invite editors and people I know to come down and meet the students and talk informally about what they do and how they got to do it. So much in the media world is knowing people, knowing who to contact, and in that way I can help the students by just bringing in some of my friends and colleagues. And in early March, we had planned an editor's night for the class at that time, and then the world changed. Columbia was much earlier than other schools, maybe a week earlier, in shutting down and telling everybody you must leave. This was immediately before our last editor's night, and I was very peeved about this. It's my way that when I'm on track, I don't easily move off track, and pandemic or no pandemic, we were going to have 12 editors come down and meet the students, and it was gone. It was the least of things that were gone. But at first, I didn't know what to do except disinvite everybody. So tonight we have 4 of the 12 editors and writers who would have been at Editor's Night if the world hadn't changed. We're going to talk about that and what we've been doing since then. So I'd like to introduce you to some of our panelists tonight. Maybe not all 12 of them, but 4 of very interesting people who have been working at the forefront of science journalism all their lives, but particularly at this moment. I mean, who would have thought that science, always sort of like a backwater on most newspapers and magazines, something that people did because they were high-minded and because they felt it was good for us, but they weren't really that bought into it. Who knew that that would become the #1 story of the time? So Apoorva Mandavilli is one of those people who, even before this crisis, when you read her work, you always remembered what she did because she has this rare gift. Not only is she a probing and interesting journalist with good sources who knows her material, but she's also a brilliant writer. And that's a rare combination. And she joined the Times in the middle of this pandemic, left her previous job as the editor of Spectrum, which is also a groundbreaking publication on issues of autism that she edited. And she came to the Times and she's had just about a front page story every week because she's been reporting the hell out of COVID. We're honored to have her here at Columbia tonight. Um, Jeffery DelViscio is my former colleague from the time I was at Science Times, and he was too. He ran the new media desk. And what that means is at a time when we weren't quite sure of what all this new technology was going to do, he was adopting it to covering science. And he did it with such a passion and such creativity that the word maker, which is used very liberally these days, really applied to him. He was just experimenting with everything and really finding new ways for us to tell stories. And then he left and he took one of the many buyouts that were being offered. And I remember when he did that, I thought, gee, you're too young to take a buyout. But he knew what he was doing. He, in a short time, went to a startup in the Boston area by the Boston Globe called STAT, and it covered medicine and the biotech industry. And they really broke a lot of new ground. Anyway, like welcome back, Carter. Jeffery DelViscio is back in New York at Scientific American, where he's tinkering with new forms. And he's going to show us later one of the things he's done in the category of fake news and our understanding it. Katherine Bagley has built her career on writing and editing about climate environment. And these are two topics that are of great interest to everybody in our program. She was at Inside Climate News, which is one of the most important publications covering climate in a regular way. And now she's at YaleEnvironment360, which is a kind of blog magazine coming out of Yale with really great reporting on both climate and environment. And she's also the author of a book about, about the Bloomberg administration and its impact on environment and climate in New York. Last but certainly not least is John Timmer, who is one of the few science journalists I know of who is a PhD scientist. And he's trained at Berkeley. And he, at a certain point in his career, just joined us ink-stained wretches, as the phrase used to be about reporters, except we don't use ink anymore, but pixels. And he became a science writer and then a science editor. He is the editor of Ars Technica, which is a web magazine published by Condé Nast. So it's science and style. What could be better? All of these reporters are taking the form forward. So we're going to talk tonight because we're from a backwater that has moved to the front and center. And I'm wondering, everybody, what were you doing in the first week in March? And what happened in your lives? What is it John Lennon said on the last day of his life? He said, life is what happens when you're making other plans. What was happening to you, Apoorva, when you were making other plans? Ooh, turn on your voice, please. We're not hearing you.
Okay, now. What was I doing? Well, I was writing about the coronavirus already, actually, because at the end of January, when we started to hear about the virus, it rang some bells for me. I'd reported on SARS before, so I was feeling some tingles about this virus. I didn't think it was going to be a pandemic. I will freely admit that I was wrong about that, but I did think that it was really interesting. And I wrote my first story about it February 5th. So by the beginning of March, I was already steeped in writing about the coronavirus and writing a lot for the Times. And as you mentioned, I had another job. So I was trying to do both and not really getting a lot of sleep. So at some point I had to make a choice. And as you said, this is the moment for science journalism. And I couldn't really see myself sitting on the sidelines or doing just the odd story when the biggest story of our lives is unfolding in front of us. So I made the move to the Times full time.
You came to the Times in a way that isn't very common. You freelanced for a while. Generally, they don't hire freelancers on staff.
Maybe not. Yeah, I'm not sure, but I think there are a couple of other people who've done that on the desk. Ronnie Rabin and
Yes.
Denise Grady both freelanced, and certainly I think it helped me in the sense that I'd already been writing for them for a couple of years, and it just ramped up with the coronavirus. And I didn't really interview when I got the job. Celia Duggar, who's the head of the science desk, just called me and said, "We'd like to hire you." And so that was that.
Yeah.
So in that way, it was really easy and great. But yeah, it's probably not the most usual way that somebody would come in.
Yes. John Timmer, what were you doing the first week in March?
So with the benefit of having a little warning there while you were talking with Apoorva, I checked when my first coronavirus article was, and it was February 3rd.
Very good.
Beat me by 2 days, John.
Excellent. Yeah, so, to give you a little more context, we have a setup where we have specialists in a number of subjects, and I'm sort of the only generalist. So in addition to editing, I cover things that sort of fall through the cracks in between subject areas. And we have a dedicated health and medicine reporter. And, normally this would be the sort of thing where, I could just shut my brain off and know that Beth Mole had this taken care of. But it was already clear by February that this was likely to be a big story, perhaps regionally and potentially globally. So I started picking up something I thought I left behind when we hired Beth to cover health and medicine. And it's just grown dramatically since. By March, it was a major portion of my week.
Does it help that you actually have a history and degrees in biochemistry and know what you're doing in terms of covering this issue?
Knowing there are limits to what I know,
there are limits to what any of us know on this.
So the first thing I wrote, having checked it, was about how to actually do testing for a virus we've never seen before. And that's a lot of molecular biology. And that was something I did, was very easy to do with my background. There's other aspects. I have never run an epidemiological model in my life. And that's turned out to be one area I've done a lot of the coverage in. And, it's been a real learning process.
Yeah. Katie, Katherine, where were you in early March?
So we, our focus is really environment and climate change. And so we had been watching, what was going on with COVID, but not really getting a sense or trying to see. At that point, it was really just a health story. And then in early March, it became very apparent that we needed to start covering this. So we, one of the challenges is we're entirely written by freelancers. And so we tend to have, and our stories are longer. We don't cover breaking news. So we had to really, we sent a lot of emails to a lot of our regular contributors expressing, send us all your COVID pitches and looking at the environmental and policy angles of it, not from a health perspective, but from, how does deforestation and illegal wildlife trade contribute to pandemics like this, and what have we learned from the past and what's happening now. And so it's sort of taking a different angle than a lot of the other publications. And we, kept up a steady stream of COVID coverage for about a month and a half. But then we also realized there's still a lot of other non-COVID stories happening. And so we started to mix back in some of our normal environmental reporting and publishing that on the site as well, and trying to find a new balance for us. And at the same time, I think it's important to note that, all of us were trying to set up offices at home and moving, entire publications to remote operations and dealing with children that are suddenly out of school at the same time that this is like the biggest or busiest time for science journalists out there. So it was a challenging spring for I think everybody in this field. Yeah.
Well, for everyone, but in your particular beat, there was a connection, although it wasn't apparent immediately, because they think that this started because people were eating bats. And this then leads into lots of conservation questions and lots of places in the world where humans and animals are being much too close together. How have you been able to make that apparent?
Yeah, so we published several stories on the connections between the illegal wildlife trade and the spread of disease in humans. We did interviews with some scientists, and we also did some original reporting and essays. And we also, in addition, did some stories sort of looking at the lessons that people could learn from the response to COVID and what that could potentially mean for the response to climate change. What were policymakers learning about tackling a really big challenge? And what, were there things coming out of the pandemic that could influence climate change? And so making a lot of different connections other than the health and strictly like sort of pure science connections.
Thanks so much. And thank you for what you've been doing. Everybody is saying to nurses and doctors, thank you for your service, but we should be thanking journalists for their services, because journalists have been putting this into perspective. People can understand what's happening to us, and that's really important. Jeffery DelViscio, old partner, old buddy, how are you? Where were you in March? You just moved to New York.
Yeah, about 6 months before that. But, on the first week of March, like a lot of places, Scientific American offices were shutting down, and everyone was sort of, fleeing to their home offices and clearing out their extra closet rooms, which I'm sitting in right now. I'm a video person, so I can hide it pretty well. At that point, anyone who's at a general science publication who both keeps track of news, but then also has, in our world there are reporters, and there are people we follow to sort of understand, especially when something like this emerges, what's happening. And so I think all of us would probably say that they had looked at Helen Branswell's reporting from STAT. Helen really was kind of first on the story. Right around New Year's Eve, she sort of got early word that things were happening, and so STAT started publishing things pretty early on. So by the time March was around, we were already covering it. Apoorva published her first story on the 5th, John on the 3rd. I published my first animated explainer on the 5th of February. So at that point, we were already rolling, knowing that this was going to be really something large. And that animated explainer was a 9-minute long animated sort of short video about the R0, the basic reproduction number. So it's one of these sort of quantities that goes into the epidemiological models and sort of is a kind of shorthand for how quickly this thing has spread. And so I worked with the health editor at Scientific American, Tanya Lewis, and the graphics editor, Amanda Montanez, and we teamed up and put together really quickly, for animation's sake, sort of a visual representation of what it means to have this number be different for different diseases, and what people were starting to, epidemiologists who are tracking this thing, were seeing was shaping up as this basic virus reproduction number, which is a sort of a kind of a shorthand for how quickly it will spread between people.
Well, you were certainly on top of it. That's impressive. Let's open this up to the students. We're going to see some of your work shortly, but meanwhile, let's open this up. Members of the class, do you have questions? You'll have to put your screens on and wave, and then I can call on you. Yes? Do I see questions? for any of our speakers? Well, then let's go and for the meanwhile, hear from some of the guests.
Katie has her hand up.
Katie has her hand up. Okay, you're seeing something I'm not. Katie, how are you?
Good, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. My question is for Katherine. I'm interested in, many have noticed that greenhouse gas emissions have decreased during the pandemic, with some of them calling this a last chance to sort of respond to climate change on the global scale. I'm curious if you see this similarly, and if, given the uphill battle in fighting coronavirus in the United States, what the challenges and opportunities around fighting climate change might look like now.
Sure. So we definitely saw a major dip in greenhouse gas emissions in the spring, but you're already seeing those emissions go back up as economies open back up again. So I don't think that it was, it had any major lasting impact on total greenhouse gas emissions. But what I do think that it did really woke people up to that there are small changes that we can make in our lives that have a big impact on our industries and our emissions. I mean, just from people cutting down the amount that they drive, so I think it provided people sort of a pathway to say, oh, this actually worked, or this is what we need to do. But I think the other challenge on the other side of that, I don't think anybody wants to go back to the time of like mass closures. And so I think it also presents a challenge of, well, is that what it takes to get these, to lower emissions this much? So I think it's sort of it's a double-edged sword, because you saw that there were actions that we could take to reduce emissions, but also, are they too drastic? Will we ever be able to take such action? Do we ever, or would people ever be willing to do that? And so I think it just raised a lot of questions, but if anything, I think it shows that actions do correspond with emissions, and that, makes that link very clear to people.
Yes, Jasmine Rajani, who is an editor, or a part-time editor at New York Magazine, but is also the TA for this class, had a question. Jasmine.
Hey, yeah, I'm. Thank you so much for being here. I had a question for Apoorva, and yeah, it seems like all the new information I get about the virus comes from you directly, and so I'm wondering how you balance uncertainty, because so much remains unknown about this virus, in your reporting of novel information.
I think the way that I try to think of it is to be as transparent as possible. So I think of all the things I don't know, and I ask my sources all of those things. And then obviously I don't put everything into the article, but I do try to be as transparent with the readers as possible about what we don't know. These days, it's actually easy for me to think about all the things that people will say about something, because I have so many trolls on Twitter, so I can just try to kind of imagine all the criticisms that will come my way. And I try to address all of those in the article, because, I mean, obviously people are coming at it from a perspective of, this doesn't make sense with what I already know, or this really scares me. And so I try to think about what it is what else people want to know beyond just the news. So I'm really lucky that I have editors and a platform and a publication that really respects context and nuance, so I can get as much into that as I would like to, and make sure that it's all there. And it's also, a lot of the time, not every single story makes it into print, or if it does, they might trim. So I sort of give myself license to really explore all the caveats.
Apoorva, you said you get lots of trolls. Are they political trolls, or and what do you do with that?
Well, so they're not all political trolls. You'd be surprised. I've been writing a lot about schools and whether kids carry the coronavirus recently, and what that means for school reopening. And a lot of the people who get very, very upset about that are actually quite far left. But on this, they just get very, very upset. And so it doesn't always fall along political lines. I do have a lot of, deniers, a lot of coronavirus deniers who say we're still basically claiming it's just like the flu. It doesn't kill anybody under 80, et cetera, et cetera. So there's still that amount of it. What do? I try a combination of, first of all, I engage most of the time, unless somebody is just absolutely rude. I do engage, I do try to answer. But if they continue in being extremely rude or swear or say really hostile things, I will sometimes name and shame them, meaning I retweet so that they, other people will see what's happening, because I think there isn't enough attention paid to the fact that this really only happens with women, and especially with women of color, but definitely women more than men. And if it really looks like a bad case or it looks like a bot, then I just block.
Okay. More questions from the students. Anybody? I'm having trouble seeing raised hands, so
So I can help you with that, Claudia.
please.
How about we hear from Claire?
Yeah, Claire is in France and landed yesterday, I guess.
Yes, exactly. Hi, thank you, everyone. So to whoever wants to take the question, maybe Katherine, I don't know. So as we said, this topic completely took over the media, at least in the beginning of March. What is an environmental event or story that happened at the beginning of March that fell through the cracks, that didn't get the coverage it deserved and that it would have had otherwise?
So Claire's question is, what science stories fell by the wayside because of the utter dominance of the COVID-19 story? Am I correct?
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Didn't get the public
yeah. Does anyone want to pick up on that?
So I can start at least. I think that maybe not necessarily in March, but definitely later in the spring, the Arctic just had an insane. They're in an insane warming period right now, with massive wildfires. Temperature records are being broken across the Arctic, and I think that that's a story that has not been told very well or very often in the midst of all this. In addition to that, there's also a massive oil spill that happened in Russia that was largely overlooked as well. I mean, it did get some media coverage, but for the most part, you get a couple of short stories. And, I, by no means, I mean, those are stories that we could have done better. And I fully acknowledge that, but with limited resources. But I think that there are lots. There was sort of caused by the pandemic, you had a ramp up of deforestation, illegal deforestation, where all of these illegal loggers were like, oh, nobody's watching us right now. We're going to go into these forests. And so that was happening at the same time. So there was a lot that was happening, which was part of the decision that we made to start backing a little bit off of our COVID coverage and making sure that we were continuing to tell these other stories.
And there are many stories that dovetail, that are both. For instance, I'm told by Sam Wasser, the elephant researcher, that elephant poaching has really accelerated with the pandemic, because as with the forest, nobody's watching. And it may be the final blow to many African elephants and to many herds. But nobody's covering that right now. And I would think there's at least a way of, as Claire says, maybe there's a need for a story of the stories we haven't been able to cover in this time.
I also think that it's worth mentioning that this is a larger question for how we all cover science, because we can all agree that this is sort of the biggest science story of our careers to date. I mean, there may be others, and climate change is arguably the longer term, more important for the trajectory of all of our lives. But in terms of an acute story that comes and just completely dominates all of our mental attention, there aren't that many aren't as many science journalism outfits left. And so we're spread thin anyway. And so when something like this comes along and we go from, as you said, Claudia, backwater to the front, there's only so many of us to throw at a story anyway. And so it's really hard to maintain all those other lines of coverage. I mean, I think Katherine does really well because her publication is so focused, and we've seen over the past few years a variety of new models going after specific sort of, they used to call them verticals, but subject areas inside of science reporting where you can go deep and long on something so far as you can find the money to support yourself. There's a whole other conversation about just sustaining science journalism in order to be able to cover this stuff, COVID and everything else we might be missing at the moment.
Do we have another 2 hours for that conversation?
Yeah, well, I can see this program is not long enough, but I'm wondering also the whole question of how you feel about the people who are not science journalists who are suddenly covering this, the biggest story of our lifetime. I, for one, have always felt that all of us as citizens in a democracy need to know some science in order to function in this democracy, and yet people don't. And that includes reporters. And suddenly, a lot of scientifically illiterate reporters were covering science because it is the biggest story of our lifetime. And to various degrees, they were good at it or not. Do you see a need to educate our fellow journalists about what we're dealing with? Or is that sort of assuming something on my part?
I think you're absolutely right, Claudia. I think that everybody ended up being a coronavirus journalist for at least a few weeks in March and April. And I think they all made a valiant try. And a lot of them succeeded. But there were also some pretty bad cases where people got things really wrong and panicked people or didn't worry people enough. At the Times, you know, the travel section was basically suspended for a while, and you know, styles writers and sports writers and everybody was a coronavirus reporter. And I think they did an amazing job actually of reaching out to the science journalists and asking, what does this mean? And can you look over this story? And can you suggest somebody I should talk to? And I think they really have tried their best.
Yeah, that John.
Can I ask you a question? Under normal circumstances where all these desks aren't shut down, if somebody from the national politics section has a story that touches on science, will they get in touch with somebody at the science desk, or do you sort of stay in your silos?
Well, I am probably not the person to ask that. Jeff might know better, but I can. It
might have changed. I don't know.
Yeah,
I think it
was touch and go before.
Yeah. I think it depends on the person, and it depends on the person and the situation. You know, one of the things about reporters is that it takes a certain amount of aggressiveness, even if you do it quietly, to really be successful at it. And the kind of people who do it and do it well are sometimes loath to accept that they don't know. And I think one of the great things about Science Times is that it is a very cooperative venture and people really support each other. But it varies in every news organization, I think. And in any case, here we had a story where all of us were not just reporters, but were impacted by it as citizens, as people, as human beings. And that made everything different. And that points to something Apoorva was mentioning, how valiant people were in covering stuff. And I think what happened was a lot of people started saying, what's happening to me? Is this a story? And in many cases, it was. There were really extraordinary pieces by people who had had the disease in their family and what it was like. And then people went out and also did what they always do, which is go to the scene, even though it was very dangerous to do so. So the answer to your question, John, I think it's a mixture of things. I'm not there in Delhi way at all. but my recollection was that it was a mixed thing. Now, how do you feel about all these political reporters and covering this issue? Are they skilled enough? Do they know what they're doing? Of course, at the times they do, but
well, I mean, you know, there are people listening to the briefings, for example, or the congressional briefings, the Senate hearings, and they don't always know what they're listening to. So they do often pull science reporters, or, you know, ask us to listen to, or send us stuff. I mean, one thing that actually I feel really lucky to have come there at this particular point, because we had a call the other day for something, I think education related, and there were all these people on the call. And I realized, even though I've only been there a couple of months officially on staff, I knew almost everybody on the call. And I think if I had joined at any other time, that wouldn't have been the case. Like I met people on national and international and investigations. And when I say met, I mean on Zoom or phone or Slack. But
no cab fare.
Right. So I think, you know, there's a newfound respect for science, as you were pointing out at the beginning. We are definitely not backwaters, and there's a lot of respect for our expertise, and there's a lot of reliance on science to get things right, which I really appreciate, because, you know, you want the best information to get out there.
Well, I think now is a good moment to look at one of the products that Jeffrey has been working on. He always loved to noodle and loved to invent things and make things. He's the original maker. But here's something he's done on the topic of, quote, fake news. I hate to even use that phrase, but it is a term now in the zeitgeist, and we have to deal with it. So Jeffrey, can we see your trailer?
Sure. And
What is it?
This is CBS News color coverage of Man on the Moon. Sponsored by Kellogg's. Kellogg's puts more in your morning. Here from CBS News Apollo headquarters at Kennedy Space Center, correspondent Walter Cronkite.
Okay, how's that?
Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there's no hope for their recovery.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House, and this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made from the White House.
Jeff, we need you to explain what you just did.
I can. So, you know, you were asking what stories didn't get covered when all the pandemic was happening. That short documentary film did not get made while the pandemic was happening. It got made in the last month and a half because I was supposed to have it done by April. But I started a project that has sort of spanned a year on deepfakes, which are, you know, synthetic AI generated media. If I can see the faces of the students in the class, not if you've seen a deepfake before, or no, yes, I'm getting some, no. Okay, so what people typically think about when they think about a deepfake, and this is not COVID, so I've just taken us in a totally different direction, but I'm sure we'll get back to COVID, is a face swap. So using machine learning algorithms, artificial intelligence, to actually take the face of basically have a machine learning algorithm understand a video and create a sort of a feature set that gets mapped to another face. So it basically swaps the face on top of the face. And so this 30-minute short documentary started out with this Nixon deepfake which you saw Richard Nixon saying that the astronauts had died, or they were going to die on the moon. Of course, we know that Armstrong and Aldrin certainly made it back. Everything went fine, but basically it was there was a speech, a contingency speech, written in 1969, 2 days after the launch, that said, in event of moon disaster. So basically, Richard Nixon was prepared to say, if they were stuck on the moon and going to die, here's how I address the American people and say, this was worth it. They're going to die, but we're not going to stop doing this sort of thing. So when I was at MIT as a Knight Fellow, before coming to Scientific American, I worked with a group of other research fellows to actually work with 2 AI companies to create this deepfake. So actually take the face of an actor and basically replace the sort of mouth movements and lips, and then also generate the voice of Nixon giving this speech that was never given. And so the short 30-minute short talk basically looks at this deepfake and then talks to a bunch of experts about where AI generated media is going in the future, how it may, affect elections, how it may completely and totally infiltrate our digital ecosystem, which is already a fraught place as we speak. And so I published it maybe 2 weeks ago, and it's got a lot of overtones to the election. But if you haven't heard of the deepfake before, there's been a lot of good reporting since 2018 done by Vice on the main uses of face swapping deepfakes now, which is synthetic pornography, unsolicited pornography, taking women's faces and putting them onto the faces and bodies of porn stars, both on a celebrity level, but then also on regular people level. And the algorithms are getting so good that they don't need, when it started, it was done on actors a lot because you needed a lot of training material. So video of the face of actors in different poses to be able to simulate and do the swap correctly. Now it's getting a lot easier to do this with much less material, including the ability to do it off your selfies on Instagram. And this is where this technology is going. And as film goes into this whole ecosystem of these providers, this sort of dark layer of the web, and a future where custom outfits provide customized deepfakes, both for educational purposes, for enjoyment, but also for very nefarious things.
So, at the time of the moon landing, there were many people who believed that it never happened, that it was in and of itself staged in Hollywood. And now you're saying
it was a tricky road to walk down.
Yeah.
Because there's so much about it was a hoax and all that sort of stuff. But, it was the 50th anniversary of the moon landing last year, and so a group of us got together and said, what could we do to show the power of the technology and the potential? Imagine hearing all of these historic speeches sort of given in a realistic way from all these sort of leaders past who have since died. You'd never be able to experience the speech this way any other way. But then look at all of the the potential negative impact and the nefarious uses of these things, both on the individual level, in terms of personalized attacks, in the case of deepfake pornography, but then also on the larger wide, the sort of state actor level, in terms of disinformation campaigns and the sort of future of the truth and where everything is going. So COVID totally swarmed this like pushed this out of the mix, but I did get back to it. And I think it's still one of those things that is going to be an important story going forward.
With the election, it may come up. So your purpose was to use the medium that you knew to tell people this is happening and show them that it's happening. That's different than describing it. Yep. Now, if any of the students don't have further questions, I would like to go wider and go to some of the questions our guests have asked. But students, speak now, or as they say, forever hold your peace. It's an oft used line. Anything?
Ben Hogan has a question.
Yes, Ben.
Hey guys, thanks for joining us. We've sort of alluded to this a few times in prior questions, but I'm curious, as authors and editors, how do you guys wrestle with the kind of moral need to unite what is a pretty divided country, very politicized, everything down to wearing a mask, with writing or running articles that get lots of readership, lots of clicks? How do you strike that balance?
Well, I think I'm almost never thinking about just getting a lot of clicks, because I think that will happen if the story is good. I'm thinking about answering questions that people have, and those can come from all different sides and all different parts of the political spectrum. So I think, like I said, one way that I try to make it really rounded is by thinking about all of the different ways in which people process that information. So, if there's a study that's small, and, the people who really, really want to believe that kids don't spread the coronavirus, just as an example, because that's the story that ran today and it's fresh in my mind. They're going to immediately say, well, that's small, and, they didn't really show this and they didn't really show that. And so I try to think about what information are they looking for, and why do they not believe what has come before this, and try to address that. And that's the way that I, so that I'm not just writing from my perspective and, oh, I already know this and I'm already convinced of this, but rather trying to think about all the things that have left people confused and mistrustful of what's coming out, and try to go there. And I think, that's a way that you can get trust from readers in a way that you can't just by going for the shiny headline and the clicks.
Yeah. I think there's a misconception and a blending of the idea of media and that puts the New York Times, the Washington Post in the same category as one of those ads you see on AOL that it's not the same thing. It just that the media flattens it and it all looks the same, but it's not. In any case, let's go to some of our guests in our closing few minutes. On that, Diana Rolls, who describes herself as a lifelong learner, says, how can I know to trust what I read and hear? And she wants you to recommend reliable sources. I don't know if you want to do that. I think, but to the question of trust, what can people learn themselves? How can they vet what they read themselves so that they can find reliable sources? Any thoughts out there among you, the guests? Apoorva or John?
Oh, I mean, a couple things. One is you could start paying attention to how different places cover news that isn't politicized or less people care about, and see how good a job they do with that. And that should give you a sense of whether the outlet is generally reliable. The other thing is, just like in science, look for a consensus. If a large number of places that are generally considered reliable are saying the same thing, there's probably a strong foundation in reality for that thing.
Well, John, what these days is not politicized? Well, mass are politicized. I mean, can you name it?
Very little overall, but at the same time, it's become clear, when we first started reporting that policy-wise the pandemic was being handled poorly, everybody got very upset because we're doing the political thing. And over time, where the situation has remained incredibly bad in the US, it became gradually obvious that saying we're handling this poorly policy-wise is no longer viewed as controversial or political. Largely, there's exceptions to that, but to some extent, the sense that talking policy was political went away over time.
Randy,
I would say, can I
yeah,
throw in
please.
a quick plug there? I mean, this moment in sort of where the media is after a bunch of years of of trying to really sort of kowtow to the platforms and increase views and do all of this backbending to try to get things on Facebook and Twitter. we sort of compressed back to this idea that, she cites Ed Yong, so clearly she's already like looking at sources that are sort of visible and maybe showing up in social feeds. This is an argument for going back to the actual sources and the outlets, like for returning to websites as a place to go first, as opposed to sort of trawling through your social feed and sort of biting anything that you sort of like comes by your face. I mean, because there are algorithms there working to try to incite your emotions, so there's behavioral management there. But on a website that's at an outlet that's been durable in covering science as a subject, minus politics, for decades, centuries even. Scientific American turned 175 years old this year. I'm not saying all the old publications are the great ones, but I'm saying the ones that are durable have an interest in presenting their work on their sites. And so maybe start going to those things. Go to the Atlantic, go to the Times, go to the Wall Street Journal, go to the pages and actually find the reporting there, as opposed to getting it from your third cousin Larry, who thinks this hydrochloroquine thing is really awesome.
I want to add one more thing to that too. I think John and Jeff made really great points, but I want to use Ben's question to flip it and say that's what you look for as the place not to go. So, the places that are obviously looking for clicks, that don't have the caveats, that make these, sweeping statements. There's no may anywhere, or could, or here's the caveat, or the study is small, or they didn't do this in the study, or anything like that, where you're the one who's actually having to look for, wait, this can't be this. If it sounds too good to be true. If it sounds too good to be true, it is, definitely not trustworthy. So anything that makes you think, oh, they just wrote this to get a lot of page views, run far away from.
Yes. Brian Esterly, I'm sorry, am I cutting someone off?
I was just going to add to that. I think, what's really important, and this builds off of what Jeff was saying, where I think that there's this tendency now to just click on a headline because it interests you. But I think that it used to be that readers had a real relationship with a publication, whether or not it was your local newspaper or a magazine that you actually subscribed to, that got delivered to your doorstep. And that sort of loyalty is gone. I think that if you find a publication that you trust, that sort of, has certain things like quotes multiple sources in a story and provides links back to the original research, I think, follow that publication and become loyal to it. And then there's also some tools that are now available. There's something called NewsGuard, which is an online service that they go through and they screen websites, and they'll tell you, this is a place that's like factually accurate, and it provides I think it's a little blue check or something like that next to them when you're going through Google searches. And there's something called the Trust Project, which is a consortium of publications that, follow certain criteria, things like, publishing bios of who's writing the articles, and following fact-checking guidelines and things like that. So there's also, I think people are acknowledging that this is a major problem, and there are some programs and projects out there that are trying to fix this. Yeah.
When you find one you trust, buy a subscription.
Yeah, it pays people's rents, and that's one of the problems with so much free media. You end up getting what you pay for. I want to try to get to a few of the current students who've written in. There is a really intriguing question from Brian Esterly, who's a current Columbia student, and he asks, how has your approach to reporting changed because of the pandemic? It's a good question. Anyone want to grab that?
Well, I look at preprints a lot more than I ever used to, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have looked at them twice before, and now a lot of what I report on is preprints. And everything is just faster.
Apoorva, on that, let me ask you, is there a greater reluctance on preprints? Is it a little dangerous? I mean, I'm wondering about the vaccine coverage, and people are reporting really early stuff because they've seen them on preprints and on press releases, for God's sakes, things you're never supposed to cover. And they're being covered.
I think that's okay to do to a certain extent because people really want to know. They want to know where things are. They want to know what's coming down the pike. But I think then the reporters have to do some serious due diligence, make sure that they do their own sort of peer review, ask enough experts to, look through the preprint and what's there and see if it's worth covering. And even if it is, point out everything that we don't know yet and all the things that we still need to know before something becomes a real vaccine, a viable candidate.
Okay. Another, any further thoughts on how your practice, as they say in academia, has changed?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to chime in. So YaleEnvironment360, a lot of our coverage is international, and that has prevented a pretty major hurdle the last few months. 40% of our audience is outside of the United States, and I would say about that much of our coverage, if not more, is international reporting. And all of our journalists, haven't been able to travel. So we've had to get really creative. We're doing a lot more collaboration with journalists that live in a certain area, but even those, reporters that are based in Brazil can't travel into the Amazon right now. And so really creative with, phone interviews and Skype interviews and, sort of weighing the risk. Those reporters that we have that have gone out into the field with us, they're very cautious, wearing masks, staying 6 feet apart. While you might have gotten in a car with a source to visit a site, you're now driving 2 cars, meeting each other at a place. And but it's been a real challenge, and I think it has fundamentally reshaped how stories are reported for a lot of people.
Do you think the reporting is as good? For instance, I've always advised my students in all my classes not to use Skype for interviews, not to use Zoom, and not to use telephones even for interviews. Go face to face. Is the material as good?
I think that's a fair question. I think you saw this trend even before the pandemic happened, that more and more people were doing calls remotely because it is, especially freelancers, like it's very expensive to go out and do these reporting trips, and a lot of publications' travel budgets for these stories are getting cut. So you sort of save your in-person reporting if you have to travel for the stories that like absolutely require it, or you go to one place, whereas in the past you might have gone to 3 places. So I think that trend was already happening pre-pandemic. I think you just saw like this total shift to it. But you're gonna, you are gonna lose things in stories. You're gonna miss, those first person scenes that really can make for really impactful openings of longer magazine length stories. And so there is definitely a loss there.
Yes, and just apropos of Zoom, which we've all learned to love and which is a lifeline for many of us right now. In that fateful March day when Dean Cohen said to me, when we had to cancel Editors Night, he said, "Why don't you do it on Zoom?" And I said, huff, huff, no way to do it on Zoom. You lose the immediacy, you lose the connection. Part of the value of it is for the students to meet the editors and the reporters and to meet them face to face. And he said, well, think about it. And then I did think about it, and here we are. And it was a really wonderful evening. I wish we had more time, but I'm so grateful for what you've shared. And we're all going to do our best in this situation, because these people out here, we live to tell the true stories of the time we're living in. That's what we do. And we want to keep doing it no matter what kind of restrictions are imposed. So thank you, Apoorva. Keep on hitting that front page. Thank you, John Timmer, for what you do. Thank you, Katherine, and thank you, Jeffrey, I'm sure I'm glad that the video you showed us is a fake. We'll hopefully, my people have a prayer that goes next year in Jerusalem. Next Editors Night in person.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for coming.